There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being laughed at before you ever learn to make people laugh with you. Rowan Atkinson knew that loneliness intimately. Long before the world fell in love with a bumbling, silent man and his stuffed bear, there was just a quiet boy on a farm in County Durham. A boy who couldn't get his words out, who sat alone at school, and who discovered, almost by accident, that stepping into a character was the only place the world made sense. He was born on January 6th, 1955, the youngest of four brothers in Consett, a small northern English town built on coal and grit. Even before Rowan was old enough to understand loss, it had already visited his family. His eldest brother Paul died as an infant, a grief that settled quietly into the household and never fully left. The remaining boys, Rowan, Rodney, and Rupert, grew up under a disciplined roof, surrounded by farmland and fresh air, far from anything resembling glamour or show business. Rodney would eventually find his way into economics and politics, nearly leading the UK Independence Party in 2000. Rowan would find his way somewhere, far stranger. Around the age of 5, he developed a stutter, not a mild hesitation, a real, grinding stutter that made every sentence feel like climbing a wall. For a child already naturally shy, it was devastating. School became something to endure rather than enjoy. At Durham Chorister's school, the other children were not kind. They mocked the way he spoke. They mocked the way he looked. His face, expressive even then in ways that seemed almost cartoonish, invited ridicule before he had done anything to deserve it. Some called him alien-like. A classmate named Tony Blair, 2 years his junior and destined for Downing Street, would later remember just how brutal those years were for Rowan. A 2007 piece in The Independent confirmed it in print. The bullying was not subtle. It was prolonged, and it left marks. But then something happened that would define everything. The moment Rowan stepped onto a stage and became someone else, the stutter stopped. Completely. As if it had never existed. The boy who struggled to order a meal or answer a question in class could perform without a single stumble the instant he was wearing someone else's skin. It was not a trick he learned. It was something he discovered, almost like finding a secret door in a wall he had been staring at for years. That door would become his entire life. Academically, Rowan was far sharper than his classmates ever gave him credit for. He achieved excellent science A-levels and at 18 enrolled at Newcastle University to study electrical and electronic engineering, a serious, technical discipline that suited his precise, analytical mind. He graduated in 1975 and followed his father's footsteps to Oxford, where he pursued a master's degree, writing a thesis on self-tuning control systems and even beginning a PhD before something more powerful than academia came calling. His tutor later recalled that Rowan never stood out in seminars, but then he would appear on a college stage and become completely unrecognizable. Not better dressed, not louder, just transformed. At Oxford, he found Richard Curtis. The two met through the University Drama Society in 1975, a collision of two minds that would eventually produce some of the most beloved British comedy ever made. Curtis watched Rowan perform for the first time at a rehearsal in early 1976 and was stunned. There was this quiet, odd-looking figure standing apart from everyone else. And then he performed, and the room changed. Curtis described it simply as genius, and he meant it without exaggeration. By the summer of 1976, the two were performing together at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and for the first time, Rowan performed for a real national audience. He was not yet famous, but something had clicked into place. The years that followed were harder than most people know. Between 1978 and 1979, the BBC turned him away repeatedly. They did not understand what he was doing. His stutter, which disappeared on stage, returned savagely during auditions and interviews. He sat in rooms full of television executives trying to explain his comedy while the words piled up behind his teeth. There were moments, genuine, serious moments, when he considered walking away from performance entirely and returning to the world of circuits and engineering. He had the qualifications. He had the intelligence. It would have been the sensible choice. He didn't make the sensible choice. Instead, he leaned harder into the discovery he had made as a child. He stopped trying to be himself in rooms full of strangers and started arriving already inside a character. It was armor. It was liberation. And slowly, painfully it worked. Not the 9 o'clock news arrived in 1979 and was, by almost every initial measure, a disaster. The first episode drew fewer than 1 million viewers. Critics were appalled. Mel Smith, who would become one of Rowan's closest colleagues, watched the pilot and reportedly called it the single worst half-hour of television he had ever experienced. Yet the BBC controller, against all logic and pressure, ordered a second series immediately. That instinct saved everything. The show, featuring Rowan alongside Pamela Stephenson, Mel Smith, and Griff Rhys-Jones, found its feet and then found its audience. It won a BAFTA. It won the Silver Rose at Montreux. A sketch called Gerald the Gorilla, in which Rowan played a primate who was, to everyone's surprise, furious about his living arrangements, became so deeply embedded in British culture that scientists began using its made-up word flange as an informal collective noun for baboons. Not every comedian can say their fictional vocabulary entered actual zoology. Behind the scenes, it was less joyful. Budget cuts gnawed at the show's ambition. A cast member was fired in circumstances Rowan found deeply unfair, and his attempts to prevent it were ignored. Tensions simmered between people who had once been close. By 1982, the cast had simply had enough. They were exhausted, not in the pleasant, satisfied way of people who have worked hard, but in the hollow, burned-out way of people running on empty. Rather than continuing for the money and the recognition, they stopped. Rowan walked away from one of the most successful comedy shows on British television because his mental health required it. That decision said more about his character than any award ever could. He walked straight into Blackadder. The first series in 1983 was a grand, expensive gamble. Castles, period costumes, a sprawling cast, and a premise that rewrote English history for comic effect. It nearly collapsed under its own ambition. Rain ruined location shoots. Costs spiraled beyond control. Reviews were lukewarm at best. The BBC seriously considered pulling the plug. Only an international Emmy, unexpected, unplanned, gave the corporation enough reason to try again. The second series, premiering in 1986 with Ben Elton aboard as co-writer, was an entirely different beast. Leaner, faster, crueler, funnier. Rowan's Edmund became a masterclass in comic contempt. Every sneer precisely calibrated, every insult delivered with the delicacy of a surgeon and the warmth of a crocodile. Tony Robinson's Baldric shuffled from reasonably competent sidekick in a lovable catastrophe, and the chemistry between them became the backbone of something genuinely special. The final series, set in the mud and slaughter of the First World War, should not have worked as comedy. It had no right to be as moving as it was. Yet Blackadder Goes Forth somehow managed to make audiences laugh until, in its very last moments, it made them catch their breath. The final scene, men walking slowly toward death, became one of those rare television moments that stays with you for life. The show won the BAFTA for Best Comedy Series in 1990. In 2004, British audiences voted it the second greatest sitcom ever made. Then came the character that would follow Rowan Atkinson to the end of his days. Mr. Bean had existed in his imagination since Oxford, a wordless, childlike figure blundering through a world that seemed faintly baffled by his presence. The first episode aired on New Year's Day, 1990, to an audience of over 13 million. It was eventually broadcast in 245 countries. It needed no subtitles, no cultural explanation, no shared language. A man and his bear and his mini, failing spectacularly at everything ordinary. It turned out this was something the whole world understood. What the world did not know was how much it cost a man performing it. Rowan has said plainly that he did not enjoy being Mr. Bean. The silence of the character, which made it so universally accessible, also meant that every emotion, every reaction, every comic beat had to live entirely in his body and his face. There was nowhere to hide, nothing to fall back on. Each episode was a physical and emotional excavation. He said he often found himself counting down to the end of filming, not because he wanted the work to be over, but because the work was genuinely painful. The 1997 feature film earned $250 million worldwide. The 2012 Olympic opening ceremony performance was watched by 900 million people globally. Both milestones felt, to Rowan, less like triumphs than like mountains he had somehow survived. Off-screen, his life moved through its own quieter dramas. He had met Sinetra Sastry on the set of Blackadder, reportedly engineering a change of makeup artists simply to have an excuse to speak to her, much to the quiet disappointment of Stephen Fry, who had his own intentions. They married in February 1990 in New York with Fry as best man, and had 2 children together over the following years. For 24 years, the marriage held. Then, in 2014, it ended. The reasons were kept private, as Rowan preferred to keep almost everything private. He had once said that the only thing more important than not discussing your personal life was not explaining why you weren't discussing it. A new relationship with actress Louise Ford, 27 years younger than Rowan, drew considerable media attention, most of it unkind. Their daughter Isla was born in December 2017. Rowan became a father again at 62. In 2012, a side of Rowan that surprised many people emerged when he delivered a 9-minute speech in Parliament defending freedom of expression. He argued that too many words were being labeled offensive and that the right to cause offense was inseparable from the right to speak freely. The speech gathered over 140,000 views online within days. Some praised it. Others, particularly LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, accused him of providing cover for hate speech. The law, ultimately, did change. The clause in the Public Order Act banning insulting words was removed. Whatever one thought of his argument, it was impossible to dismiss him as merely a comedian in a rubber face. He had opinions, he had read the legislation, and he was not afraid to stand up in Parliament and say what he thought. There was also the moment in March 2001 that very few people discuss, and that Rowan himself rarely mentions. He was on a private flight over Kenya with his family when the pilot fainted midair. Rowan, a man who had never once flown a plane, grabbed the controls and kept the aircraft steady until the pilot regained consciousness and landed them safely in Nairobi. He was 46 years old. He had just done something that ought to have been impossible, and he went home and said very little about it. On January 6, 2025, Rowan Atkinson turned 70. He has won 12 major awards, been nominated 18 more times, and built a body of work that has made people laugh on every inhabited continent. The Mr. Bean YouTube channel has accumulated over 12 billion views. Comedy schools teach something now called the Atkinson method. Scholars of physical performance compare him to Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. His face, once mocked by school children in Durham, is one of the most recognized on Earth.